Coming up in tonight's episode of Faith versus Culture, Facebook and big tech, they see a future in virtual church. We'll discuss the pros and cons next.
To have sex before you marry is a bad idea.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence.
That just depends on your definition of when life begins.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Faith versus Culture right here on the CBN News Channel. My name is Dan Andros. I am the managing editor of CBN's Faithwire.com, joined this week by journalist and author Billy Hallowell. Billy, what's going on?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, we got a lot to cover. We're gonna talk about this interesting kind of edict from Facebook's sort of faith conference that they had. But also I wanted to talk about the insane rise in homeschooling and what is driving that surge. I think that pertains to Christians a lot. And also, too, we've got to talk about the latest Satan shoes that are out. I don't know why everyone keeps making Satan shoes, but we'll show you the brand that's, I guess, dabbling in the occult. And look, you're an expert on these demon issues, Billy. I mean, I don't know. It makes me a little suspicious of you that's what you're an expert on. But
I am. It's an area of intrigue, but I'll tell you, these stories are crazy, and I feel like they keep getting weirder and weirder as we'll discuss. Yeah.
Let's start here on big tech and Facebook. And you have the chief operating officer for Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg, who is Jewish. I did not know that until checking out this article. But she said she's looking forward to the day when churches and other religious groups begin hosting services in virtual reality. And I think that means that's a little different than just online service, like kind of what we're experiencing now because of COVID. And so that's a vision that they share. She said, as a person of faith myself, I know how important it is for my family to be able to stay connected with our Jewish community remotely. We've been able to celebrate high holy days from our home thanks to technology. And she talked about how that's kind of the point of Facebook, at least as they see it, is to bring people of like minds and that share interests, bring them together, allow them to be able to connect in ways that they normally couldn't if they're not geographically near one another. So on the outset, it seems like, all right, it seems like a good idea. I mean, we've benefited from COVID, being able to not miss church when we were really forced not to. But let's flesh this one out a little bit, Billy. Where can we see some positives? What are some things we need to be concerned about?
Well, so when we talk about virtual reality, the thing I'm picturing is like having the glasses on, right?
Right.
And looking around and you're in church, like you're in the sanctuary.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know exactly if that's what she's imagining, but let's start with the positives, right? The positives, you just mentioned it, COVID, what we just went through, all of the things, even some people are still remote for different reasons, if they're immune compromised, whatever. It was really positive to be able to watch church at home, right? To be able to still be engaged. If this had happened 15, 20 years ago, we really would have been in a very strange situation where a lot of people would have been disconnected. They'd be doing their own Bible studies. They'd be doing things, on their own with maybe their family without having that connection. So there is a lot of positivity to having the technology. The other positive that I want to mention is that when you look at this, there's been a lot of assumptions about social media in general, and some things have maybe proven true at moments about information being restricted and whatnot. And one of the areas of concern has been faith. It is interesting to watch Facebook dive deep into this faith discussion. And they have been, I can tell you firsthand experience working with them at different organizations, Christian organizations, and seeing what they're doing. So there's some positive there. I think on the other side, though, and then you could speak to this, I'm sure, but my concern is that we're encouraging people potentially to not be in person in community, which is a major part, in my mind, of our faith. Again, in community together, celebrating and worshiping Jesus. It seems like that's a hard thing to do remotely only.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, the Bible tells us to gather together. And I know some people have said, well, we're gathering together when we gather virtually. And I don't think that that's true, because you're able to get the message. And I think that's great. Like when you're in a pinch, and, I know a couple times we've had to be traveling for various reasons. And so we're still able to get the message from church. And that's great. But you want that to be the exception, not the rule. And you want to be with the saints. You want to be with other believers. And to really be in the presence, because people just don't share the same way they do online. And first of all, you can't talk to anyone. It's a one-way message when you're receiving online church, right? Like it's really an emergency stopgap, in my view, so that you can just get the message and still at least be connected that way, and not feel like you completely skip church. But you don't get to talk to people. You don't get to, say, hey, how you doing? And have somebody, share something maybe they're going through. Or sometimes a lot of churches, they lay hands on one another when they pray. And there's so much more depth about meeting in person with one another that even with the virtual goggles on, I don't think you're going to be able to replicate.
I just keep picturing myself wearing them like in my living
Everyone's
room
sitting
alone,
at
and there's
home
people
going-
like reaching out to touch people who aren't there. I think for me, it's almost like, I think this is great in a lot of ways, right? You've got this focus on faith. We want to build community. To me, that's in addition to church, right? It's like, how can this, think about Facebook as a company, no matter what people think. I know there's lots of different views about social media companies right now, but as a company has made a decision to bring in Nona Jones, who's really heading this faith partnerships deal they've got going on and up. And she's a believer, and they've got her making these connections. There's a lot you could do with virtual Bible studies. And again, that's another great thing to do in person. But the reality is it opens us up to a lot of really cool things we could do in addition to church. But I don't know about you. When I was remote from church and COVID was going on, I missed being at church. I wanted to be around people. I was dying to have that connection. And I just don't think we can replicate that. So to me, I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. It is interesting to look at different ways that we can integrate Facebook in, but I don't think it's a replacement for church personally, and I don't think it should be.
Another thing I want to talk about with big tech here, Billy, is I think that on the one hand, there's good interest there. You can see Sandberg saying, she's Jewish, and they bring in Nona Jones, and they have all these people that they're connecting, the faith groups. But then there's the other side of me that sees big tech that always seems to be conveniently canceling or accidentally suspending the accounts of Christian conservatives. And I just can't help but think putting more of our infrastructure in church online is setting ourselves up for a disaster when it comes to censorship, because we all know how big tech and mainstream culture views mainstream Christian views on LGBT issues in particular. I think that would be the most obvious one, where they're going to say, oh, well, wait a minute, we don't allow hate speech. That goes against our community standards, which is a popular term that everybody should be familiar with now if you've used big tech. They just use that as a bludgeon to just delete people or suspend them. And then when they realize they've overstepped their bounds and everyone complains, they go, you know what? We made an error. At some point, it's not going to be an error. And I think putting too much of ourselves, where we're kind of setting up our infrastructure, how we do church online, is a bad idea.
Unless we're in control of it, right? Unless we have control of the platform where it's happening, or we, and that's obviously a lofty goal, but there are companies and organizations and some of the bigger churches. Listen, if you've got some of these big mega churches who have figured out their own tech on some of this, or they're kind of watching what Facebook is doing and recreating it themselves in terms of hosting online events and things like that, I think we can learn a lot in that way, right? But I 100% agree. Listen, I watched, for when Unplanned came out, when that movie came out, I remember watching the Twitter account get suspended the weekend that movie came out, right? Now, it was a mistake, apparently, that account was suspended, just so happened to be on the movie's release weekend. Right. And, there were lots of sketchy things about that. But I think that we don't know where culture will be in 5 years, but we know where it is right now, and it's not great. And so to assume that it's not going to get worse, it probably will. And I think you make a great point. We need to make sure that we're protecting, if we're going to invest in something and put all this effort and time into it, that it's not going to just be shut down at some point because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's shift gears right over into the spiritual realm of demonic forces of wickedness, Billy. Another shoe company has decided to replace their famous logo with a pentagram. So I don't know why, but we're gonna tackle this story, and we'll do it on the other side of the break. This is Faith versus Culture. All right, we're back on this episode of Faith versus Culture. Dan Andros here, Billy Hallowell there this week, joining us as we cover stories that matter for the intersection of faith and culture. Talked last segment about Facebook's desire to move towards virtual church. And, Billy, I was thinking it's kind of one of those things that would have been like a silly idea that everyone would have thought, no way that's even going to come close to happening. And then COVID hits, so it's actually more something that now people are a little used to, so it could happen. So if you it went from being a Babylon Bee story to a not the Bee story, and not too much time there. So if you want to hear that conversation, go check out the last segment. But for now, we are going to transition over here to, if you like Converse, this is going to probably put a little damper on that. Earlier this week, Converse unveiled a new limited edition collaboration with fashion designer Rick Owens through his brand. How do you even say that? I don't even know what that is. DRK.
I didn't even try.
Dark Shadow. Yeah, okay, I get it. I get it now. All right, Dark Shadow. Got it. The sneakers, coming in several styles, feature a pentagram in place of the iconic Chuck Taylor star, and there you can see it there. I want to read this statement, Billy, because you have written a book that dives into demonic activity, and the Bible. We've talked about it. The Bible's clear. That's a real thing if you are a Bible believer. So it's real, but for Bible believers, you know what I mean. All right, so let's read this. Let's read this quote here from the designer, because this is interesting. He said, "I've been using this pentagram for a long time because obviously it has adolescent occult associations, but I like geometric diagrams because in a very primal way, there's a culture's grasp for control and a way to organize thoughts and systems. And a pentagram in this day and age, with all of its associations, I like the fact that it refers to an alternative system. And that suggests openness and empathy. It suggests the pursuit of pleasure, the pursuit of sensation. But one of the main things that I think it suggests is empathy and a consideration of systems of living that might not be standard. So that leads us to be more accepting and tolerant of other systems, which I think is a good thing." Wow. That is a statement that I would not have expected to be associated with this, but what did you, as someone who's covered the occult and all this, what did you think when you read that?
So when I first read it, the first thing I thought, and I wrote a lot about this in Playing with Fire, is that, culture right now is sort of descending into this confusion and this moral relativism. And you read this, and it's really interesting because, we're treating these things, these symbols of evil, right? And we've had two different shoe dramas unfold now over this. And both times it's like, oh, this is no big deal. It's almost this normalization and then pretending as though, he says here, it's adolescent occult associations. You pretend it's just this childish thing that isn't real. So we've moved from actually just praising something into pretending it's not real, but then still praising it by putting the symbol on something. And what's so fascinating about this statement, as you read through it, he dismisses it sort of as, again, adolescent. And then he starts talking about, he likes the fact that it's about alternative systems and openness. And the empathy part is really interesting, but the pursuit of pleasure, even when you were reading it, I think that stuck out to you. The pursuit of pleasure and, the pursuit of sensation. And you start to realize, whether this person realizes it or not, what they're starting to describe is what we actually see sort of unfold, the focus on the self, right? When you move into this realm of sort of looking at how evil affects us and how, and let me just pull back on that a little bit, how a disassociation or a disregard for God would affect us as human beings. And that's what we're watching in our culture. So not to overcomplicate that, but the statement's actually very telling to me in light of this subject matter.
That is interesting. And another thing I see is, that because it is interesting that you mentioned that it's like very kind of dismissive, like you said, of sort of the implications of, the occult, just these childlike occult things. It's no big deal. But then the association with empathy. And I think, because this is this is Satan, who is the literal embodiment of evil. And you're trying to then associate it with good. And I think, we know in Romans, what the Bible says in Romans about, I think Romans 1 about, flipping that kind of on its head, like what's good is, evil and what's evil is good in their eyes. And so I think that's what you kind of have going on here. And I think you see a lot of that in culture now, where there's not just a disagreement on what is good. There is a flip, like abortion, for example. It used to be safe, legal, and rare. But now what is the secular crowd going for? That shout your abortion. Like they're trying to say this is good. So you're seeing
normalize it.
Yeah.
Normalize it.
And praise it. Yeah. Make it like this is an okay thing. Sex work is another one. And I think a lot of that is the secular left, secular progressives kind of have realized their inconsistencies on some of these things and are realizing like, oh, why am I okay with allowing that? Because it's good. It's empowered. So that is interesting to me, because I think that is part of a larger cultural trend where we're seeing Romans 1 play out, where things that are evil are being described as good.
Absolutely. And you have this disregard, again, that dismissal at the top of this statement. If you're going to put a pentagram, the pentagram has meant a lot of different things to a lot of different religions over the years. You can go all the way back to the beginning of human history. It has appeared in different ways. But the current meaning of what this is, and this is acknowledged in this statement, is it's associated with the occult and with evil and with witchcraft. That's what it's associated with. And so you have, though, this sort of diminished acceptance of Ephesians 6, this battle over good and evil. It's almost as like, this isn't even real. We don't need to care about it. We can pretend it's silly. And that's such a deception, because we know this is real. And the irony of it is, here is this symbol of evil being slapped on shoes, right? And being put out there. And I think for me, that's one of the most troubling things, is the idea that none of this is real and that we're just going to live our best lives and do whatever we want. And we see that in this. I mean, the statement is that this is a reminder to sort of seek pleasure. And everything you were saying about Romans 1 is 100% accurate.
Yeah. All right. Good stuff. We will be back on the other side of the break. I think not disconnected here, Billy. We're going to talk about homeschooling. Maybe you should, just looking at some of the things going on here. I don't know. Maybe it makes some sense. So we'll talk about that rise in homeschooling and why people are doing it on the other side of the break. This is Faith versus Culture. Back in a second. All right, we're back on this episode of Faith versus Culture, and we are here. Dan Andros here, Billy Hallowell there. We're going to dive in. We got a couple minutes left. I wanted to touch on this homeschooling story, Billy. We've got Satan shoes coming out left and right. So, maybe you want to keep them a little closer to the nest. I'm just saying. But there's a huge soaring number of homeschooling happening after COVID. And it's interesting because we interviewed on CBN, we interviewed a few people that talked about what they are hearing or the reasons for this surge. And a common theme for a number of parents is that their kids performed well while homeschooling and they don't want to change that. I found that one pretty interesting. And a lot of the other reasons too that they added were that they're frustrated with, a lot of the mask policies, that their kids are going to have to wear masks when they come back. Obviously, CRT is a big hot button issue, critical race theory. People disagree on that. But just one example, Billy, Virginia alone, over 48% increase in homeschoolers in just the last year. They went from 44,000 to 65,000. So, and that was just one group's tally. So, and then we're seeing similar trends in other states and across different ethnic groups. African Americans saw a big spike as well. So, interesting stuff there, and the timing on this on the homeschooling.
Yeah, there was one organization that serves African Americans in homeschooling, and they had, I think the growth was insane. There were 5,000 members before the pandemic, and there were over 30,000 members after the pandemic. And well, it's not over yet, the pandemic apparently, but after the initial sort of chaos, and that to me is remarkable. But you mentioned CRT, you've got the gender discussion, which is big in schools right now. It's almost like the perfect storm in education right now. All of these things for years that have kind of been bubbling, these conversations about things that are being maybe talked about in classrooms or debate about whether or not they should be talked about. And then you have the pandemic where you actually have a chance to see, what is it like for my kid to be home? What is it like for me as a working parent to be there with them? All of that has sort of come together. And I'm really interested to see, throughout this school year, how that develops and grows, because that kind of growth, 5,000 to 30,000 or more, is unprecedented. I mean, you couldn't pay for better growth if you're trying to have that as an organization.
Yeah, and it is tough to pin down the exact reason, but like you said, I think it's a perfect storm of things. And the other factor that's assisting this is because I think a lot of parents are two parent working homes. And so it makes homeschooling kind of a non-starter because they're like, well, we both work. But now, because so many people are working from home because of the pandemic, they got used to that. A lot of companies are like, hey, this works just fine. If you want to work at home, do it. So now a lot of them are figuring out, hey, I can actually do this because I can kind of, I can take a break here and I can, check in on them and keep them going and then go back to my work. And it gives them a little more flexibility. So it's a unique time that's allowing all of this to take place.
It is. And, school choice was always the conversation that a lot of people on the conservative side would have. And nobody ever thought, again, how did the pandemic change life? Nobody ever really thought that a form of school choice, I mean, it always is part of that, but this big of one would be homeschooling. I mean, it's really interesting to think through that forcing people to be home with their kids may have actually sparked thousands of people to say, you know what, this is a better option for me. And so it just creates some new windows of opportunity, even for businesses. If you're trying to hire people, do you take this into account? If they have families, having more flexible schedules, does that benefit your business too, maybe? So there's a lot to consider there.
Yeah. All right. That's all the time we have for today. Billy, thanks so much for joining us and stopping by this
Thanks
week.
for having
Appreciate
me.
your time. All right. We'll be back to wrap it up. On the other side of the break, this is Faith versus Culture. All right, that is all the time we have for this episode of Faith versus Culture. Thanks as always for being here. And also, as always, we'll be praying for you throughout this week. We hope you have a great one. God bless. We'll see you back here next time.